Hello and welcome to Pendant and Ring. This is part 7 of an ongoing audiobook series. We're reading The Lives of the Tudor and Stuart Princesses by Agnes Strickland. Queen Mary with her infirm lord remained at Abbey until the last day of October, when his illness permitted him to move forwards to the magnificent Abbey of St. Denis, where, in the palace connected with the ecclesiastical establishment, the royal pair waited for the completion of the preparations for her coronation. Here a letter from Wolsey arrived, November 2nd, dated from Eltham Palace, in which it appeared that the sovereign will and pleasure of Henry VIII was announced that his beloved sister should not pine for the fostering care of her motor Guildford. Dr. West and the resident ambassador took upon themselves to learn whether the old king still remained obdurate against the banished lady, and from the answering dispatch may be gathered the real state of the royal minds of husband and wife. Worcester was granted an audience of Louis XII in private, and the French monarch thus expressed himself regarding Mother Guildford. "My wife and I," said the King of France, "be in good and perfect love, as ever any two creatures can be. We are both of age to rule ourselves. She was 16, he was 60, and not to have servants that should look to rule her or me. If my wife need of counsel or to be ruled, I am able to do it. But I am sure it never is the Queen's mind to have her (Lady Guildford) again. For as soon as she came landed, and also when I was married, Lady Guildford began to take upon her not only to rule the Queen, but also that she should not come to me, but she should remain with her, nor that no lady nor lord should speak to the Queen, but she, Lady Guildford, should hear it. Withal, she began to set a murmur and banding (a faction) among the ladies at the French court." No one can blame King Louis for declining the society of such an interloper. Few newly married people would be any the happier for the company of a motor Guildford, it will be owned. Then proceeded the great King of France to discuss the more delicate points of his young queen's wishes respecting the return of the woman under whose care she had been reared. After affirming with an oath that no man loved his wife better than he did, his Majesty continued, "Rather than have such a woman about my wife, I would liever be without one. I know well, when the king, my good and loving brother, knows this my answer, he will be contented. For in no wise will I have her about my wife. Also, I am a sickly body, and not at all times that I would be merry with my wife, like I too have any strange woman with her, but one that I am well acquainted withal, afore whom I durst be merry." An awful idea his French Majesty here gives of the stiff precision of the royal gouvernante, no attractive auxiliary to the loves and graces of a royal honeymoon. It must be owned that the inflexibility of the good-natured Louis XII is remarkably developed in this dramatic description of his home life. However, he would not have been the great man history truly designates him if he had been afflicted with any propensity to variableness of will and purport. The line of policy he took with his fair bride proves his acute knowledge of the human heart. He gave her the notion that he had wholly set her at liberty, and that it was unsuitable for a queen to have a mistress dictating to her. "I am sure," continued he to the Earl of Worcester, "the Queen my wife is content withal, for I have set about her neither lady nor gentlewoman to be with her for her mistress, but for her servants, and to obey her commandments." "Upon which answer," observes the ambassador, "seeing the King of France would in no wise have the Lady Guildford, I replied to him again, so that he was content, I made no doubt but the King's grace my master would be, which answer had been well debated ere I gave it." The conclusion of this despatch turns on a point of great importance to Mary's future destiny. Suffolk, it seems, was preparing to present himself at the scene of her coronation as Queen of France. When Lord Worcester had an interview with her Majesty to inquire her mind and pleasure, she thus declared herself: "My Lord Worcester, I love Lady Guildford well, but I am content that she come not here, for I am in that case that I may be well without her, as I can do whatever I will." I pray God, adds Lord Worcester, it may ever continue so to his pleasure. The Duke of Suffolk and the Marquis of Dorset were appointed to deliver letters to the King and Queen of France at St. Denis, November 3rd. Thanks were formally tendered from Henry VIII by these ambassadors, extraordinary for their honourable receivings and meeting of the Queen, his sister, at her first arrival at Boulogne, especially for meeting her in person before her entrance at Abbeville, as also for the loving and honourable entertaining of her ever since. Louis XII named the day after that, Sunday, November 5th, for the coronation of his bride in the royal abbey of St. Denis. Accordingly, the next Sunday all was prepared in that stately fane for the solemnity. The Queen had not far to travel, but merely to advance with her procession from her royal apartments when the doors were thrown open. An hour before her entrance, the Duc de Montmorin went to the lodging of the Duke of Suffolk, and courteously conducted him, before the crowd poured in, to the seat for the ambassadors at the end of the choir, to the right of the high altar. Those who are acquainted with the locality of St. Denis will know this seat was situated so near the chancel that the persons engaged in the august ceremonial might perfectly be seen from thence, and even be heard to speak. The king's closet window was just over the same, where he appeared, without pomp or state, as a private spectator, to behold his bride receive the crown matrimonial of France. Mary was preceded by the great officers of France bearing her regalia, all being princes of the blood royal. The Duke of Alençon, the Duke of Longueville, the Duke of Albany, lately made Regent of Scotland, and a prince of the blood in right of his mother and his wife, the Duke of Bourbon, and the Count of Vendôme, his brother. The young queen came then, led by Francis, Duke of Valois, her husband's heir and son-in-law. First, the queen knelt before the altar of St. Denis, just below the place where the oriflamme of France is still to be seen. Here she was anointed by Cardinal de Prie, the same ecclesiastic who married her to Louis XII. He put the sceptre in her right hand, and the verge of justice in her left. This symbol in France has always the figure of a hand at the summit. The cardinal put a ring on her finger, and then set the great crown of Jane of Navarre on her head. Francis of Valois led her, thus crowned, up a raised platform to a chair of state prepared for her, which was under the canopy of the throne by the altar. But the crown of state weighed unbearably heavy on the temples of the young queen, who was perhaps perturbed by the presence of her former lover, stationed near to her seat of grandeur. Francis of Valois, whose admiration of her exquisite loveliness began to be noted in France, relieved her of the weighty diadem, but at the same time, not to deprive her of the state and dignity appropriate to the ceremony, stood behind her, holding it above her head. And a noble tableau must the lofty and graceful figure of Francis have made, thus contrasted with the delicate beauty of the English Queen of France, before the eyes of the assembled multitudes of all degrees, which thronged from base to clerestory of the glorious minster of St. Denis. Then began the high mass, sung in by the cardinal, whereat the queen offered. The afternoon was devoted to diplomatic deliberations with the English ambassadors, but in the evening the Queen gave Suffolk and his coadjutors a private audience in her withdrawing room. King Louis left St. Denis as early as 7 in the morning for Paris, in order to receive his queen, who was to make her grand entry into that city from St. Denis after her coronation, the proudest day of a French queen's life, if her beauty and grace could bear the critical observations of the Parisians. Mary Tudor departed from St. Denis at 9 in the morning. She dined at a village 2 miles from Paris. The road between St. Denis and Paris at present offers no village of this kind. The afternoon was the time appointed for the entry of the English Queen of France into Paris. The royal dinner hour was at noon. Mary incurred some blame for having introduced such a new-fashioned luxurious dinner time. The king's health had been hurt by it. For whereas, says one of his chroniclers, Louis XII loved to observe the good old custom of dining at 8 in the morning and going to bed at 6 in the afternoon, but it now suited his young queen that he should dine at noon and not go to rest till midnight. As for his custom of going to bed at 6 in the evening, it is to be hoped that was in winter, for in summer the very cocks and hens usually sit up 2 hours later than did his Christian Majesty. Mary ascended a carriage called a chaise or chair, in which she sat solus. It was covered with cloth of gold, shot with white, and drawn by 2 milk-white steeds, with housings of the same tissue and silver reins and harnesses. The beautiful queen was crowned with a precious circlet formed entirely of the largest and purest pearls the treasury of France could furnish, without the intrusion of any other gem. By way of contrast, her neck and bust were radiant with inestimable diamonds and other sparkling jewels. Around her car, protecting her person, marched, as their place of right, the Royal Scotch Archer Guard, under the command of her handsome kinsman, the Duke of Albany, already named Regent of Scotland. Immediately preceding them went, to clear the way, a troop of Louis XII's German mercenary cavaliers, the renowned lansquenets. Francis of Valois, heir presumptive of France, rode before the carriage of the young queen, accompanied by the other princes of the blood royal, being his kinsmen the Duke of Alençon, Bourbon, Vendôme, and Longueville, with whom was the Duke of Suffolk, likewise the Queen's first cousin, Thomas Marquis of Dorset, whose young daughter, Lady Anne Grey, with Anne Boleyn, had remained among the young maidens left with Mary Tudor, and now followed her car. Thank you for joining us today. Subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Pendant and Ring.